Welcome to The Sandman, a story by E.T.A. Hoffmann. The Sandman is the tale of the little man who puts sand in your eyes to help you fall asleep. Or is it? The description from the back of the book reads, The Sandman is the disturbing tale of a young man's obsession with the Sandman, stealer of eyes, which has inspired writers from Sigmund Freud to Neil Gaiman. This is part 1 of a collection of videos. Thank you for stopping by. And now, on to the story. Enjoy. Nathaniel to Lothair. I know you're all very uneasy because I have not written for such a long, long time. Mother, to be sure, is angry, and Clara, I dare say, believes I am living here in riot and revelry, and quite forgetting my sweet angel whose image is so deeply engraved upon my heart and mind. But that is not so. Daily and hourly I think of you all, and my lovely Clara's form comes to gladden me in my dreams, and smiles upon me with her bright eyes as graciously as she used to in the days when I used to associate daily with you. Oh, but how could I write to you in such a distracted state of mind in which I have been, and which until now has bewildered me? A terrible thing has happened to me. Dark forebodings of some awful fate threatening me are spreading themselves out over my head like black clouds, impenetrable to every friendly ray of sunlight. I must now tell you what has taken place. I must, that I see well enough, but only to think of it makes the wild laughter burst from my lips. Oh, dear, dear Lothair, what shall I say to make you feel, if only in an inadequate way, that what happened to me a few days ago could thus really exercise such a hostile and disturbing influence upon my life? I wish you were here to see for yourself. But now you will, I suppose, take me for a superstitious ghost seer. In a word, the terrible thing which I have experienced, the fatal effect of which I in vain exert every effort to shake off, is simply that some days ago, namely on the 13th of October, at 12 o'clock at noon, a peddler of weather glass and thermometers came into my room and wanted to sell me one of his wares. I bought nothing and threatened to kick him down the stairs, whereupon he went away of his own accord. You will conclude that it can only be very peculiar relations intimately intertwined with my life, that can give significance to this event, and that it must be the peddler himself who had such a very unpleasant effect upon me. And so it really is. I will summon up all my faculties in order to narrate to you calmly and patiently enough about the early days of my youth, to put matters before you in such a way that your keen, sharp intellect can grasp everything clearly and distinctly in bright and living colors. Just as I am beginning, I hear you laugh and Clara say, "What's all this childish nonsense about?" Well, laugh at me. Laugh heartily at me, pray do. But good God! My hair is standing on end, and I seem to be entreating you to laugh at me in some sort of frantic despair in which Franz Moore entreated Daniel to laugh at him in scorn. But to my story. Except at dinner, we, i.e., I and my brothers and sisters, saw little of our father all day. His business, no doubt, took up most of his time. After our evening meal, which usually was served at 7 o'clock, we all went, mother with us, into father's room, and took our places around the round table. My father smoked his pipe, drinking a large glass of beer at the same time. Often he told us many wonderful stories and got so excited over them that his pipe would go out. I used to then light it for him with a spill, and this formed my chief amusement. Often again he would give us picture books to look at, while he sat silent and motionless in his easy-chair, puffing out such dense clouds of smoke that we were all, as it were, enveloped in mist. On such evenings mother was very sad, and as soon as it struck 9 she said, "Come, children, off to bed. Come, the Sandman is come, I see." And I always did seem to hear something trampling upstairs with slow, heavy steps. That must be the Sandman. Once in particular I was very frightened at this dull trampling and knocking. As mother was leading us out of the room, I asked her, "Oh, Mamma, who is this nasty Sandman who always sends us away from Papa? What does he look like?" "There is no Sandman, my dear," Mother answered. "When I say the Sandman is come, I only mean that you are sleepy and you can't keep your eyes open, as if somebody had put sand in them." The answer of my mother's did not satisfy me. Nay, in my childish mind the thought clearly unfolded itself that Mother denied there was a Sandman only to prevent us from being afraid. Why, I always heard him upstairs. Full of curiosity to learn something more about this Sandman and what he had to do with us children, I finally asked the old woman who acted as my younger sister's nurse what sort of man he was, the Sandman. "Why, Thaniel, darling, don't you know?" she replied. "Oh, he's a wicked man, who comes to little children when they won't go to bed and throws handfuls of sand in their eyes so that they jump out of their heads all bloody. And he puts them into a bag and takes them to the half-moon as food for his little ones, and they sit there in the nest and have hooked beaks like owls, and they pick naughty little boys' and girls' eyes out with them." After this I formed in my own mind a horrible picture of this cruel Sandman. When anything came blundering upstairs at night I trembled with fear and dismay, and all that my mother could get out of me were the stammered words, "The Sandman! The Sandman!" while tears coursed down my cheeks. Then I ran into my bedroom and the whole night through tormented myself with the terrible apparition of the Sandman. I was quite old enough to perceive that the old woman's tale about the Sandman and his little ones in the nest in the half-moon couldn't be altogether true. Nevertheless, the Sandman continued to be, for me, a fearful incubus. And I was always seized with terror. My blood always ran cold, not only when I heard anybody coming up the stairs, but when I heard anybody noisily open the door to my father's room and go in. Often the Sandman stayed away for a long time altogether. Then he would come several times in close succession. This went on for years without my being able to accustom myself to this fearful apparition, without the image of the horrible Sandman growing any fainter in my imagination. His intercourse with my father began to occupy my fancy more and more. I was restrained from asking my father about him by my unconquerable shyness, but as the years went on, the desire waxed stronger and stronger within me to fathom the mystery myself and to see the fabulous Sandman. He had been the means of disclosing to me the path of the wonderful and the adventurous, which so easily find lodgment in the mind of the child. I liked nothing better than to hear or read horrible stories of goblins, witches, dwarves, and so on. But always, at the head of them all, stood the Sandman, whose picture I scribbled in the most extraordinary and repulsive form, with both chalk and coal everywhere, on tables, and cupboard doors, and walls. When I was 10 years old, my mother removed me from the nursery into a little chamber off the corridor, not far from my father's room. We still had to withdraw hastily whenever on the stroke of 9 the mysterious unknown was heard in the house. As I lay in my little chamber, I could hear him go into father's room, and soon afterwards I fancied there was a fine and peculiar-smelling steam spreading itself through the house. As my curiosity waxed stronger, my resolve to make the Sandman's acquaintance somehow or other took deeper root. Often when my mother had gone past, I slipped quickly out of my room into the corridor, but I could never see anything. For always, before I could reach the place where I could get sight of him, the Sandman was well inside the door. At last, unable to resist the impulse any longer, I determined to conceal myself in father's room and wait there for the Sandman. One evening I perceived from my father's silence and my mother's sadness that the Sandman would come. Accordingly, pleading that I was excessively tired, I left the room before 9 o'clock and concealed myself in a hiding-place close beside the door. The street door creaked, and slow, heavy, echoing steps crossed the passage toward the stairs. Mother hurried past me with my brothers and sisters. Softly, softly I opened the door to father's room. He sat as usual, silent and motionless with his back towards the door. He did not hear me, and in a moment I was in and behind a curtain drawn before my father's open wardrobe, which stood just inside the room. Nearer and nearer and nearer came the echoing footsteps. There was a strange coughing and shuffling and mumbling outside. My heart beat with expectation and fear. A quick step now, close, close behind the door. A noisy rattle of the handle, and the door flies open with a bang. Recovering my courage with an effort, I take a cautious peep out. In the middle of the room, in front of my father, stands the Sandman, the bright light of the lamp falling full upon his face. The Sandman, the terrible Sandman, is the old lawyer Coppelius, who often comes to dine with us. But the most hideous figure could not have awakened greater trepidation in my heart than this Coppelius did. Picture to yourself a large, broad-shouldered man with an immensely big head, a face the color of yellow ochre, gray bushy eyebrows, from beneath which two piercing greenish cat-like eyes glittered, and a prominent Roman nose hanging over his upper lip. His distorted mouth was often screwed up in a malicious sneer, then two dark red spots appeared on his cheeks, and a strange hissing noise proceeded from between his tightly clenched teeth. He always wore an ash-gray coat of an old-fashioned cut, a waistcoat of the same, and neither extremities to match, but black stockings and buckles set with stones on his shoes. His little wig scarcely extended beyond the crown of his head. His hair was curled round high up above his big red ears, and plastered to his temples with cosmetic, and a broad-closed hair-bag stood out prominently from his neck, so that you could see the silver buckle that fastened his folded neckcloth. Altogether, he was a most disagreeable and horribly ugly figure, but what we children detested most of all was his big, coarse, hairy hands. We could never fancy anything he had once touched. This he had noticed, and so whenever our good mother quietly placed a piece of cake or sweet fruit on our plates, he delighted to touch it under some pretext or another, until the tears stood out on our eyes. From disgust and loathing we lost the enjoyment of the tidbit that was intended to please us. And he did just the same thing when father gave us a glass of sweet wine on holidays, when he would quickly pass his hand over it, or even sometimes raise the glass to his blue lips, and he laughed quite sardonically when all we dared to do was express our vexation in stifled sobs. He habitually called us little brutes, and when he was present we might not utter a sound, and we cursed the ugly, spiteful man who deliberately and intentionally spoiled all our little pleasures. Mother seemed to dislike this hateful Coppelius as much as we did, for as soon as he appeared, her cheerfulness and bright and natural manner were transformed into sad, gloomy seriousness. Father treated him as if he were some being of some higher race, whose ill manners were to be tolerated, while no effort ought to be spared to keep him in good humor. Coppelius had only to give a slight hint, and his favorite dishes were cooked for him, and rare wine uncorked. As soon as I saw this Coppelius before, the fearful and hideous thought arose in my mind that he, and he alone, must be the Sandman. But I no longer conceived the Sandman as the bugbear in the old nurse's fable, who fetched children's eyes and took them to the half-moon as food for his little ones. No, but as an ugly, spectre-like fiend, bringing trouble and misery and ruin, both temporal and everlasting, everywhere he appeared. I was spellbound on the spot. At the risk of being discovered, and as I well enough knew, of being severely punished, I remained as I was, with my head thrust through the curtains, listening. My father received Coppelius in a ceremonious manner. "Come to work," cried the latter in a hoarse, snarling voice, throwing off his coat. Gloomily and silently my father took his dressing-gown, and both put on long, black smock frocks. Where they took them from, I forgot to notice. Father opened the folding doors of a cupboard in the wall, but I saw that what I had so long taken to be a cupboard was really a dark recess, in which was a little hearth. Coppelius approached it, and a blue flame crackled upward from it. Round about were all kinds of strange utensils. Good God! As my father bent down over the fire, how different he looked! His gentle features seemed to be drawn up by some dreadful convulsive pain into an ugly, repulsive, satanic mask. He looked like Coppelius. Coppelius plied the red-hot tongs and drew bright glowing masses out of the thick smoke and began assiduously to hammer them. I fancied that there were men's faces visible around them, but without eyes, having ghastly deep black holes where the eyes should have been. eyes here, cried Coppelius in a hollow, sepulchral voice. My blood ran cold with horror. I screamed and tumbled out of the hiding-place onto the floor. Coppelius immediately seized me. You little brute, he bleated, grinding his teeth. Then snatching me up, he threw me on the hearth, so that the flames began to singe my hair. Now we got eyes. A beautiful pair of children's eyes, he whispered, and thrusting his hands into the flame, he took out some red-hot grains and was about to throw them into my eyes. Then my father clasped his hands and entreated him, saying, Master, let my Nathaniel keep his eyes. Oh, let him keep them. Coppelius laughed shrilly and replied, Well then, the boy may keep his eyes, and whine and pule his way through the world. But we will at any rate examine the mechanism of the hand and the foot. And thereupon he roughly laid hold of me, so that my joints cracked and twisted, and my hands and my feet, pulling them now this way and now that. That's not quite right altogether. It's better as it was. The old fellow knew what he was about. Thus lisped and hissed Coppelius, but all around me grew black and dark. A sudden convulsive pain shot through all my nerves and bones. I knew nothing more. I felt a soft warm breath fanning my cheek. I awakened as if out of the sleep of death. My mother was bending over me. Is the Sandman still here? I stammered. No, my child, he's gone. A long, long time. He'll not hurt you. Thus spoke my mother, as she kissed her recovered darling and pressed him to her heart. But why should I tire you, my dear Lothair? Why do I dwell at such length on these details, when there's so much remains to be said? Enough, I was detected in my eavesdropping, and roughly handled by Coppelius. Fear and terror brought on by a violent fever, of which I lay ill several weeks. Is the Sandman still here? These were the first words I uttered on coming to myself again, the first sign of my recovery, of my safety. Thus, you see, I have only to relate to you the most terrible moment of my youth for you to thoroughly understand that it must not be ascribed to the weakness of my eyesight, if that all I see is colorless, but to the fact that the mysterious destiny has hung a dark veil of clouds about my life, which I shall perhaps only break through when I die. Coppelius did not show himself again. It was reported he had left town. It was about a year later, in our old manor, when we sat around the round table in the evening. Father was in very good spirits, and was telling us amusing tales about his youthful travels. As it was striking 9, we all at once heard the street door creak on its hinges, and slow, ponderous steps echoed across the passage and up the stairs. That is Coppelius, said my mother, turning pale. Yes, it is Coppelius, replied my father in a faint, broken voice. The tears started from my mother's eyes. But father, she cried, must it be so? This is the last time, he replied. This is the last time he will come to me, I promise you. Go, now go and take the children. Go to bed. Good night. As for me, I felt as if I were converted into cold, heavy stone. I could not get my breath. As I stood there immovable, my mother seized me by the arm. Come, Nathaniel, come along. I suffered myself to be led away. I went into my room. Be a good boy and keep quiet, Mother called after me. Get into bed and go to sleep. But tortured by indescribable fear and uneasiness, I could not close my eyes. It seemed that hateful, hideous Coppelius stood before me with his glittering eyes, smiling maliciously down upon me. In vain did I strive to banish the image. Somewhere about midnight there was a terrific explosion, as if a cannon were being fired off. The whole house shook. Something went rustling and clattering past my door. The house door was pulled to with a bang. "That is Coppelius," I cried, terror-stricken, and leaped out of bed. Then I heard a wild, heart-rending scream. I rushed into my father's room. The door stood open, and clouds of suffocating smoke came rolling towards me. The servant maid shouted, "Oh, my master, my master!" On the floor in front of the smoking hearth lay my father, dead, his face burned black and fearfully distorted, my sisters weeping and moaning around him, and my mother lying near him in a swoon. "Coppelius, you atrocious fiend, you've killed my father!" I shouted. My senses left me. 2 days later, when my father was placed in his coffin, his features were mild and gentle again as they had been when he was alive. I found great consolation in the thought that his association with the diabolical Coppelius could not have ended in his everlasting ruin. Our neighbors had been awakened by the explosion. The affair got talked about, and came before the magisterial authorities, who wished to cite Coppelius to clear himself, but he had disappeared from the place, leaving no traces behind him. Now when I tell you, my dear friend, that the peddler I spoke of was the villain Coppelius, you will not blame me for seeing impending mischief in his inauspicious reappearance. He was differently dressed, but Coppelius's figure and features are too deeply impressed upon my mind for me to be capable of making a mistake in the matter. Moreover, he has not even changed his name. He proclaims himself here, I learn, to be a Piedmontese Mechanician, and styles himself Giuseppe Coppola. I am resolved to enter the list against him and avenge my father's death, let the consequences be what they may. Don't say a word to Mother about the reappearance of this odious monster. Give my love to my darling Clara. I will write to her when I am in somewhat calmer frame of mind. Adieu. That's all the Sandman for today. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you're looking forward to part 2. Thank you so much for listening.